Good evening and welcome back to Shaded Past. The story of the Second World War does not begin with Hitler marching into Poland in September of 1939. It does not even begin in the 1930s with Mussolini's parades in Rome or Japan's soldiers advancing into Manchuria. To truly understand why the world plunged into another catastrophic conflict, we must return to the moment when the guns of the First World War fell silent. November 11, 1918. The Armistice, a day that brought joy, yes, but also confusion, bitterness, and wounds so deep they would not heal in a single generation. The First World War was supposed to have been the war to end all wars. In reality, it was only an intermission. The Second World War was born in its ashes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Europe in 1918 looked like a continent torn from its foundations. Vast stretches of northern France and Belgium were reduced to wasteland. Villages that had stood for centuries were now piles of stone. Churches, schools, and farms lay in ruins. In some regions, farmers plowed their fields only to bring up bones and unexploded shells. Trees were reduced to blackened stumps. Mud still clung to trenches that zigzagged across the landscape like scars. And in towns far from the front, the absence of young men was felt in every shop, every church pew, every family gathering. Nearly 10 million soldiers were dead, another 20 million wounded, and millions of civilians gone. The lost generation was not just a poetic phrase. It was a reality lived every day in Britain. War memorials sprang up in nearly every village, each one etched with rows of names. In France, whole towns mourned sons who would never return, their fields tended now by widows and children. In Germany, the grief was deepened by humiliation. For defeat came not only on the battlefield, but also in the minds of many who believed they had been betrayed. The sense of mourning was universal, but its expression differed. Some prayed, some built monuments, others drank, trying to drown the memories of mud, rats, gas, and death. When the victors gathered in Paris in 1919 to decide the terms of peace, they came with their own wounds and their own agendas. The French, led by Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, demanded harsh punishment. France had been invaded twice in living memory, and Clemenceau wanted to make sure Germany could never rise again. The British under David Lloyd George tried to balance retribution with practicality, fearing that too much punishment might destabilize Europe. And the Americans, guided by President Woodrow Wilson, came with dreams of a new world order, a League of Nations, and self-determination for all peoples. These competing visions clashed in smoke-filled rooms and grand halls of Paris. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. For Germany, the treaty was devastating. It stripped the nation of its colonies in Africa and the Pacific. It reduced its army to 100,000 men, barely enough to maintain order at home, and forbade tanks, planes, and submarines. Its navy was gutted. The Rhineland, a vital industrial region, was to be demilitarized. Alsace-Lorraine were returned to France. The Polish corridor split Germany in two, severing East Prussia from the rest of the country. And looming above all else was reparations. 132 billion gold marks, a sum so large it could never realistically be paid. German politicians signed the treaty reluctantly under the threat of renewed invasion. Many saw it not as peace but as humiliation. In cafes, in veterans' clubs, in homes across the nation, bitterness took root. The word diktat, a dictated peace, echoed with venom. The years that followed were a nightmare for ordinary Germans. In 1923, inflation spiraled out of control. The government, struggling to meet reparations payments, printed money at a frantic pace. At first, prices rose slowly, then faster, then wildly. Soon the currency was worthless. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Housewives rushed to the market twice a day before prices doubled by evening. Children played with stacks of banknotes as if they were building blocks. Families who had saved for decades saw their life savings vanish overnight. A photograph from the time shows a man using banknotes as wallpaper because it was cheaper than buying actual paper. Farmers refused to sell food for currency that lost value by the hour. People starved in the shadow of granaries. And yet, even amid this chaos, life continued. Couples still married, though rings were often made of tin. Schools tried to teach, though teachers went unpaid. Berlin cabarets pulsed with jazz and dance, imported from America, offering temporary escape from despair. Writers, painters, and thinkers flocked to the capital, producing daring works that challenged old traditions. But beneath the glitter of the so-called Golden Twenties lurked anger, humiliation, and longing for stability. Many Germans looked at their fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic, and saw weakness. The memory of order, even authoritarian order, began to feel tempting. Germany was not the only nation in turmoil. Across Europe, empires had crumbled. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was carved into new states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, leaving the Middle East divided into British and French mandates. The Russian Empire had already fallen to revolution in 1917, giving birth to the Soviet Union after years of civil war. Poland reappeared on the map after more than a century of absence. But these new borders, drawn in the ink of diplomats, ignored centuries of ethnic, religious, and linguistic divisions. Tensions simmered, waiting to explode. In Italy, victory in the war felt completely hollow. The Italian people had been promised grand territorial rewards for joining the Allies, but at the peace tables of Paris, most of these promises were broken by their wealthier partners. Discontent spread rapidly through factories and farms across the country. Strikes erupted in major cities, workers occupied heavy industrial plants, and landless peasants demanded immediate agricultural reform. Into this national chaos marched Benito Mussolini, a former socialist turned fierce nationalist. Backed by his paramilitary group, the Black Shirts, and armed with a dangerous rhetoric of iron strength, complete unity, and cultural rebirth, he successfully manipulated the public's fear of a communist revolution. In 1922, his calculated march on Rome brought him directly to power as prime minister. Within a few short years, Italy was transformed into the world's very first fascist state, creating a dark, functional blueprint that would soon inspire other radical movements across the continent, including a young, deeply bitter German veteran named Adolf Hitler. The lingering scars of the Great War were not merely physical or political. They were deeply and profoundly psychological. Millions of veterans returned from the front lines carrying heavy, invisible wounds. Shell shock, what modern medicine now recognizes as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted countless households across Europe. Some men suffered from uncontrollable stuttering, while others trembled violently at sudden loud noises or the simple hum of a domestic machine. A vast majority could not speak of the horrors they had witnessed in the mud. Families struggled desperately to understand husbands, brothers, and sons who had physically come home but were never truly the same people again. Writers like Erich Maria Remarque captured this universal despair in groundbreaking novels such as All Quiet on the Western Front, a raw narrative that stripped away the myth of military glory and painted the war as a senseless, mechanized slaughter. The book resonated with grieving audiences across international borders, though in Germany it infuriated radical nationalists who claimed it explicitly dishonored the millions who had died for the fatherland. Meanwhile, silent cities of the dead continued to multiply across the European continent. Rows upon rows of pristine white crosses stretched toward the empty horizons of Flanders and Normandy. Stone monuments were raised in almost every town square, engraved with the names of the fallen, sometimes so many that entire communities seemed permanently inscribed in cold stone. The rituals of mourning quickly became a structural part of daily life, with church bells tolling each November 11th and school children observing mandatory moments of silence. Yet, even as people grieved, uncomfortable questions lingered in the quiet hours of the night. Was the war truly fought for freedom? Had a generation of youth died completely in vain? Could this fragile peace last? Or was another far more destructive storm already gathering on the horizon? In Great Britain, the global empire appeared entirely intact on paper, yet significant cracks were beginning to show beneath the surface. Overseas colonies that had contributed hundreds of thousands of their own men and vast economic resources to save the British Crown were now loudly demanding political recognition and self-rule. In India, the jewel of the British Empire, the promises of wartime cooperation quickly dissolved into systemic bloodshed. Over 1 million Indian soldiers had served in the mud of Europe and the sands of the Middle East, operating under the distinct assumption that their loyalty would be rewarded with greater political autonomy. Instead, they returned to find a colonial government determined to tighten its grip through emergency wartime legislation made permanent. The boiling point arrived in April of 1919 in the city of Amritsar. A peaceful crowd of men, women, and children gathered in a walled public garden known as Jallianwala Bagh to celebrate a spring festival and protest new restrictive laws. Without warning, British colonial troops under the command of Brigadier General Reginald Dyer blocked the only narrow exit and opened fire on the trapped assembly. For 10 agonizing minutes, the soldiers fired systematically until their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Hundreds lay dead, and over 1,000 were wounded, trapped within walls they could not scale. The Amritsar massacre effectively shattered any remaining illusion of British moral authority in the subcontinent. It galvanized a quiet, unassuming lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi, transforming a scattered resistance into a massive, unstoppable movement for absolute independence. The message was unmistakable. The old empires were bleeding from within, their foundations structurally weakened by the very war they claimed to have won. Across the English Channel, France was experiencing its own hollow victory. Although the nation had successfully reclaimed Alsace-Lorraine and forced Germany into economic submission, the physical and psychological toll was catastrophic. 1 in every 4 Frenchmen between the ages of 18 and 27 had been wiped off the face of the earth. The industrial north was a graveyard of flooded coal mines and shattered factories. Desperate for long-term security, the French military began constructing one of the most massive defensive liabilities in human history, the Maginot Line. This multi-billion franc network of subterranean concrete fortresses, tank obstacles, and machine gun nests stretched along the German border. It was a masterpiece of military engineering designed to fight the previous war. It symbolized a nation gripped by deep anxiety, physically fortifying itself against a ghost it had failed to truly exorcise at the Versailles peace table. As the late 1920s bled into the 1930s, the fragile economic illusions that held the post-war world together shattered entirely. The American stock market crash of October 1929 was not merely a domestic financial crisis. It was a geopolitical earthquake that triggered the Great Depression. For nearly a decade, the fragile Weimar Republic of Germany had survived on a life support system of short-term American loans used to pay reparations to Britain and France. When Wall Street collapsed, those loans were abruptly recalled. Almost overnight, the German economy plummeted into total darkness. Factories shuttered their doors. Bank vaults locked tight. By 1932, over 6 million Germans, nearly 1/3 of the entire working population, were unemployed, standing in endless, freezing soup lines that snaked through the gray streets of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. In this climate of absolute despair, the moderate political center dissolved. Democracy, to the average citizen, looked like a luxury of the wealthy, a system that produced nothing but endless debates while children starved. The desperate public began looking to the political fringes for salvation. On one side stood the German Communist Party, promising a worker-led revolution modeled after the Soviet Union. On the other side stood a radical, fringe group that had spent the 1920s dismissed as a collection of unhinged fanatics, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. At the center of this movement was Adolf Hitler. Hitler was not a political anomaly. He was a mirror reflecting the deepest, darkest traumas of the German psyche. He was a master of the microphone, possessing a terrifying ability to weaponize public grievance. In crowded, smoke-filled beer halls and massive, torch-lit stadiums, his voice would rise to a hypnotic frenzy as he told the German people exactly what they wanted to hear. He told them that they were not responsible for the Great War. He told them they had been betrayed by a shadowy cabal of Marxists, corrupt politicians, and outsiders. He promised to rip up the hated Treaty of Versailles, to restore the military to its former glory, and to provide bread and jobs to every German worker. Most importantly, he offered them a scapegoat for their misery and a return to national pride. In the legislative elections of 1930 and 1932, the Nazi Party's vote skyrocketed from a meager 2% to the largest political bloc in the Reichstag. The wealthy industrialists and conservative politicians of Germany, terrified of a communist revolution, mistakenly believed they could control the volatile Austrian corporal. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg officially appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Within 6 months, using the pretext of the Reichstag fire, Hitler systematically dismantled the Weimar Republic. Political opponents were arrested and sent to primitive concentration camps. Independent labor unions were banned. The press was brought under absolute state control. The fragile democracy was dead, replaced by the totalitarian apparatus of the Third Reich. Germany was now a nation entirely mobilized for a singular, unspoken purpose: vengeance. While Germany transformed into a garrison state, the international institution built to prevent another world war was exposed as a toothless facade. The League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson's idealistic dream, was structurally crippled from birth. The United States Senate, retreating into a deep shell of isolationism, flatly refused to join the League. Without American economic and military weight, the institution lacked real authority. The first fatal blow to collective security came from the Far East. Japan, an island nation with limited natural resources, had watched its economy dry up during the global depression. The radical militarists who had seized control of the Japanese government looked across the sea to the vast, resource-rich Chinese territory of Manchuria. In September of 1931, using a staged explosion on a Japanese-owned railway near Mukden as a pretext, the Imperial Japanese Army launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. China appealed directly to the League of Nations for help. The League responded by sending a committee, issuing a lengthy report condemning Japanese aggression, and politely asking Tokyo to withdraw its troops. Japan's response was swift and telling. Their delegation stood up, walked out of the League of Nations Hall in Geneva, and continued their conquest of Manchuria, renaming it the puppet state of Manchukuo. The world watched, and the world did nothing. The lesson was clear to every aggressive dictator on Earth. The international community would not spill blood to enforce peace in Rome. Benito Mussolini took careful notes. Anxious to distract his people from domestic economic struggles and eager to build a new Roman Empire, Mussolini turned his sights toward Africa. In October of 1935, Italian armies, equipped with modern tanks, bombers, and poison gas, invaded the independent, sovereign nation of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie traveled personally to Geneva to stand before the League of Nations. His speech was a haunting prophecy. He warned the assembly that the targeting of small nations would eventually lead to the destruction of Western civilization itself. "It is us today," he told the quiet room, "it will be you tomorrow." The League voted to impose minor economic sanctions on Italy, but deliberately omitted oil, the one resource Mussolini needed to fuel his war machine. Britain and France, desperate to keep Mussolini as a potential ally against a rising Germany, refused to close the Suez Canal to Italian military ships. The sanctions failed completely, Ethiopia was swallowed by the Italian Empire, and the League of Nations effectively ceased to exist as a credible peacekeeping force. Seeing the complete paralysis of the Western democracies, Adolf Hitler decided it was time to test the waters of European resolve. His first major gamble occurred in March of 1936. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the Rhineland, the region bordering France and Belgium, was to remain permanently free of German military forces, serving as a vital buffer zone. Hitler ordered a small force of 30,000 German troops to march across the Rhine bridges, directly violating both the Versailles Treaty and the subsequent Locarno Pact. Behind the scenes, German generals were terrified. Their army was still in the early stages of rebuilding, and they knew that if the French military mobilized even a fraction of its forces, the German troops would be utterly crushed. Hitler himself later admitted that the 48 hours following the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking of his life. But France was politically paralyzed, caught in the middle of a bitter national election and unwilling to act without British support. And London took a casual view of the crisis. Politicians remarked that the Germans were merely walking into their own backyard. No shots were fired. No French divisions moved. Hitler's gamble succeeded brilliantly, cementing his authority over his hesitant generals and proving to him that the Western Allies would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid a fight. By 1937, Adolf Hitler no longer needed to hide his ambitions. The laboratories of the Third Reich had spent 4 years working in absolute secrecy, and now the fruits of their labor were unveiled to a stunned global audience. The Forbidden Air Force, the Luftwaffe, boasted thousands of cutting-edge fighter planes and tactical bombers. Heavy panzer divisions rolled off assembly lines, practicing a revolutionary, fast-moving doctrine of warfare that the world would soon come to fear as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Hitler turned his sights toward his first territorial target, his own birthplace, Austria. The Treaty of Versailles had explicitly forbidden the unification of Germany and Austria, known as the Anschluss. But by March of 1938, the Austrian government was thoroughly infiltrated by Nazi sympathizers. Under the direct threat of a bloody invasion, the Austrian chancellor resigned. On March 12, German troops crossed the border. Instead of facing resistance, they were met with carefully orchestrated crowds waving swastika flags and throwing flowers. Hitler entered Vienna in absolute triumph, absorbing a nation of 7 million people into the Reich without firing a single bullet. The Western democracies issued polite, diplomatic notes of protest. In London, the consensus remained unchanged. It was not worth spilling British blood over an internal Germanic affair. The map of Europe was being redrawn by force, and the architects of peace were fast asleep. With Austria secured, Hitler immediately manufactured his next crisis. He turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, specifically a mountainous border region known as the Sudetenland. This area was home to 3 million ethnic Germans, but more importantly, it contained Czechoslovakia's formidable network of border fortifications, heavy artillery, and the massive Skoda munitions factories, the industrial backbone of the region. Hitler falsely claimed that the Czech government was brutally persecuting the German minority. He publicly demanded the immediate surrender of the Sudetenland to Germany, openly threatening a full-scale European war if his demands were rejected. Unlike Austria, Czechoslovakia was a wealthy, modern democracy with a highly disciplined army and explicit military alliances with both France and the Soviet Union. The Czechs were fully prepared to fight. All they needed was a guarantee that their Western allies would stand beside them. Instead, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, stepped in. Chamberlain was a man driven by a genuine horror of war. He looked at the modern bombers of the Luftwaffe and calculated that a conflict with Germany would result in the immediate catastrophic destruction of London. He was determined to find a diplomatic exit at any cost. In September of 1938, Chamberlain flew to Germany, culminating in the infamous Munich Conference. In a grand, cold hall, Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier sat across from Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. The Czechoslovakian government was deliberately locked out of the room. They were not allowed to participate in the debate that would decide their survival. In the early hours of September 30th, Britain and France signed the Munich Agreement. They handed the Sudetenland to Hitler on a silver platter, effectively destroying Czechoslovakia's defenses and rendering the country helpless. In return, Hitler signed a worthless scrap of paper promising that this was his absolute last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain flew back to London, stepping off the aircraft while waving that piece of paper to an ecstatic crowd. He proudly declared that he had secured peace for our time. But in Paris, Daladier was under no such illusion. Seeing the cheering French crowds welcoming him home, he privately muttered in disgust that they did not know what they were cheering for. 6 months later, in March of 1939, Hitler completely violated the agreement. German tanks rolled into Prague, obliterating what remained of Czechoslovakia. The state was erased from the map, its vast armaments absorbed into the growing Nazi war machine. Appeasement had failed utterly. It had not prevented a war. It had simply ensured that when the war arrived, Germany would be infinitely stronger. By the summer of 1939, the dark clouds of war were visible to everyone. Hitler's next target was painfully obvious. Poland, specifically the Free City of Danzig and the Polish corridor that separated East Prussia from the German mainland. But this time, Britain and France drew a line in the sand. Realizing the profound error of Munich, they issued a formal guarantee to Warsaw, promising that if Germany attacked Poland, they would declare war immediately. Hitler, however, was a master of geopolitical calculated risks. He knew there was one missing piece on the European chessboard that could ruin his plans: the Soviet Union. If Germany invaded Poland, it risked facing a two-front war against Britain and France in the west, and Joseph Stalin's massive Red Army in the east. It was the exact strategic trap that had destroyed Germany in World War I. The world assumed that a treaty between Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union was an absolute ideological impossibility. Hitler had built his entire political career on hatred of communism. Stalin had spent a decade framing fascism as the ultimate evil. Yet, on August 23, 1939, the world awoke to a stunning, terrifying announcement. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in Moscow. The public text stated that the two rival regimes would maintain peace between themselves. But hidden within the document was a cynical, secret protocol. Hitler and Stalin had officially agreed to carve up Eastern Europe between them. Poland was to be brutally partitioned down the middle, with the western half going to Germany and the eastern half to the Soviet Union. The Baltic states were handed to Stalin's sphere of influence. The final obstacle to total war was officially removed. Hitler had secured his eastern flank. The trap was set, and the fate of Poland was sealed in the dark ink of two dictators. At dawn on September 1, 1939. The waiting ended. Without a formal declaration of war, German panzer divisions smashed across the Polish border, while thousands of Luftwaffe bombers darkened the skies, raining destruction on Polish sleeping cities, airfields, and rail junctions. This was the debut of the Blitzkrieg, a synchronized hammer blow of armor, motorized infantry, and overwhelming air power designed to paralyze the enemy before they could even organize a defense. The Polish military fought with immense bravery, but they were structurally outmatched. Their strategic plans were based on a linear defense of their long borders, leaving their flanks dangerously exposed to the fast-moving German armored columns that bypassed strongpoints and cut off communications. Rumors later spread of Polish cavalry charging German tanks with lances, a myth created by German propaganda to paint the Poles as backward, but a testament to the sheer desperation of a nation fighting a mechanized juggernaut. On September 3, 1939, the political landscape shifted permanently. Honoring their defensive alliances, Great Britain and France issued final ultimatums to Berlin, demanding an immediate cessation of hostilities. When the deadlines passed without a response, both nations formally declared war on Germany. Neville Chamberlain addressed the British public over the radio, his voice heavy with defeat, acknowledging that everything he had worked for had crashed into ruins. The second great conflict of the 20th century had begun, but for the moment, Britain and France could do almost nothing to physically assist their dying ally. To make matters worse, on September 17th, the trap snapped shut completely. Adhering to the secret protocols of the Non-Aggression Pact, the Soviet Red Army invaded Poland from the east. Caught between two totalitarian titans, the Polish state was crushed. Warsaw held out under a brutal, relentless bombardment until late September, refusing to surrender until its water, food, and ammunition were entirely exhausted. Poland was systematically divided between Hitler and Stalin, entering a dark night of occupation that would see the systematic execution of its intellectual elite and the construction of the first Nazi death camps. With Poland erased from the map, an eerie, unsettling quiet fell over Western Europe. For the next several months, a period began that journalists mockingly dubbed the Phony War or the Blitzkrieg. British troops crossed the English Channel and deployed along the French border, taking up positions alongside the massive concrete fortresses of the Maginot Line. Soldiers sat in their trenches, playing cards, writing letters home, and staring across no man's land at German troops who were doing the exact same thing. This period of inactivity was a grand illusion. While the Western democracies waited, hoping against hope that economic blockades might bring down the Nazi regime without a bloody ground war, Hitler's factories were working 24 hours a day, churning out thousands of advanced tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. The German military spent these vital months analyzing the lessons of the Polish campaign, refining their tactics, and preparing for an onslaught that would shock the world with its speed and savagery. In April of 1940, the terrifying quiet of the Phony War came to a sudden, violent end. Hitler turned his eyes toward Scandinavia. In a lightning amphibious and airborne operation, German forces launched a simultaneous assault on Denmark and Norway. Denmark, flat and militarily exposed, capitulated in less than 6 hours. Norway fought on with British and French support, utilizing its rugged fjords to slow the German advance. However, the German Luftwaffe dominated the skies, and by June, Norway fell completely under Nazi occupation. Hitler had secured vital iron or shipping routes from Sweden and established strategic naval bases along the Atlantic coast, dealing a massive blow to the British Royal Navy. The disaster in Norway triggered a massive political crisis in London. The British public and Parliament lost all confidence in Neville Chamberlain's leadership. During a fierce debate in the House of Commons, members of his own party turned on him. On May 10, 1940, Chamberlain resigned. Stepping into the breach was a man who had spent the entire decade warning the world about the Nazi threat: Winston Churchill. Churchill became Prime Minister at the exact hour the true storm burst upon Western Europe. On that very same morning, May 10th, the German war machine launched its grand offensive in the West, invading Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The Allied High Command had spent years preparing for this exact scenario. Believing the Germans would duplicate their strategy from World War I, the finest British and French divisions rushed north into Belgium to meet the advancing enemy. This was precisely the trap the German generals had designed. The main Allied advance left the pivot point of their line dangerously exposed. This pivot point was the Ardennes Forest, a rugged, heavily wooded region of hills and narrow roads along the border of Luxembourg and France. French military experts had confidently declared the Ardennes completely impassable to tanks, leaving the area defended by poorly equipped, second-line reserve divisions. They were catastrophically wrong. The real weight of the German invasion was concentrated right here. Under the brilliant planning of General Erich von Manstein, a massive armored spearhead consisting of 7 cutting-edge panzer divisions tore through the dense forests of the Ardennes, completely blindsiding the French defenders. By May 13th, German tanks had crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, breaking out into the open French countryside. Once through the line, the panzers did not turn toward Paris as the French expected. Instead, they raced westward toward the English Channel at a breakneck pace. This maneuver became known as the Sichelschnitt or sickle cut. Moving with terrifying speed, German tanks bypassed major cities, severed communication lines, and destroyed supply depots in the Allied rear. The elite British and French armies that had rushed into Belgium suddenly realized they were completely cut off, trapped in a shrinking pocket against the sea with their backs to the coast. By May 24th, the German armored columns had reached the coast, trapping nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers in and around the French port city of Dunkirk. The situation appeared entirely hopeless. The French army was fracturing, and the British Expeditionary Force faced total annihilation or capture, an event that would have effectively knocked Great Britain out of the war. Then, a strange development occurred. Hitler issued a highly debated halt order, stopping his panzer divisions just short of Dunkirk for 48 hours. The reasons remain a subject of historical debate, ranging from a desire to preserve his tanks for the final assault on Paris to Hermann Göring's arrogant promise that his Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped forces alone. This brief pause handed the British a miraculous window of opportunity. The Royal Navy launched Operation Dynamo, a desperate, improvised evacuation plan. Churchill called upon the British public for assistance, and an extraordinary armada materialized. Over 800 vessels, including destroyers, merchant ships, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, and lifeboats manned by civilian volunteers, braved relentless Luftwaffe bombings and artillery fire to cross the treacherous English Channel. Between May 26th and June 4th, this legendary fleet of little ships successfully rescued over 338,000 Allied soldiers from the burning beaches and harbors of Dunkirk. While it was a stunning logistical triumph that preserved the core of the British Army, Churchill soberly reminded his nation that wars are not won by evacuations. France was now left to face the full weight of the German military alone. On June 5th, the panzers turned south toward Paris. The French army, stripped of its best divisions and suffering from a complete collapse of morale and leadership, could not hold the line. Paris was declared an open city to save it from physical destruction, and German troops marched down the historic Champs-Élysées without firing a shot. On June 22, 1940, the final humiliation was delivered. The French government, now led by the aging wartime hero Marshal Philippe Pétain, signed an armistice with Germany. Hitler dictated that the signing take place in the exact same railway carriage where Germany had been forced to sign the armistice of 1918. Under the harsh terms, northern and western France were placed under direct, brutal German military occupation. The South remained nominally independent, ruled by a collaborationist puppet regime based in the spa town of Vichy, headed by Pétain. France had fallen in just 6 weeks, leaving Great Britain completely isolated, standing alone against a totalitarian empire that dominated the entire European continent. With France effectively erased from the chessboard, Adolf Hitler turned his full, undivided attention across the English Channel. Great Britain stood entirely alone, protected only by the treacherous waters of the Channel and the fierce determination of her people. Hitler assumed that the British government, realizing the sheer hopelessness of their isolation, would sue for a negotiated peace. He had no genuine desire to destroy the British Empire, viewing it as a vital pillar of global stability. But he had completely miscalculated the resolve of Winston Churchill. In a series of legendary speeches, Churchill made it clear to the world that Britain would never surrender, choosing total destruction over submission to Nazi tyranny. Faced with this unexpected defiance, Hitler ordered his military staff to prepare for a full-scale invasion of the British mainland, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. However, the German generals and admirals knew that an amphibious invasion across the Channel was an absolute impossibility as long as the British Royal Navy dominated the seas. And the Royal Navy could not be driven back unless the German Luftwaffe could first eliminate the Royal Air Force and gain absolute control of the skies. Thus began the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign in human history fought entirely in the air. Throughout the sweltering summer of 1940, the skies over southern England turned into a swirling canvas of smoke and fire. Day after day, hundreds of German bombers and sleek Messerschmitt fighters roared across the coast, targeting British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Standing against this massive onslaught were the young pilots of the Royal Air Force, flying their iconic Hurricane and Spitfire fighters. These pilots were often fresh out of training, some just teenagers, flying multiple missions a day until they collapsed from sheer physical exhaustion. The British possessed a secret weapon that shifted the balance of power, a revolutionary network of coastal radar stations known as chain home. This technology allowed the RAF to detect the exact size, altitude, and direction of incoming German formations before they even crossed the Channel. Instead of flying wasteful, exhausting patrols, British fighter controllers could precisely vector their limited squadrons to intercept the enemy at the perfect moment. Despite this advantage, by late August, the RAF was reaching its absolute breaking point. Airfields were cratered, sector control rooms were destroyed, and pilot losses were far outpacing the rate of replacement. Britain was dangling by a thread. Then, a pivotal turning point occurred due to a tactical error. During a night raid, a lost German bomber squadron accidentally dropped its payload on a civilian neighborhood in London. In retaliation, Churchill immediately ordered a daring, symbolic bombing raid on Berlin. Though the physical damage to the German capital was minimal, it absolutely infuriated Adolf Hitler, who had publicly bragged that foreign bombs would never fall on the fatherland. In a fit of rage, Hitler ordered Hermann Göring to shift the Luftwaffe's targets away from RAF airfields and focus instead on flattening British cities. This period became known as the Blitzkrieg. On September 7, 1940, a massive armada of nearly 1,000 German aircraft darkened the skies over London, unleashing a terrifying rain of high explosives and incendiary bombs. For 57 consecutive nights, London was systematically firebombed. Citizens sought refuge in the deep underground subway stations, sleeping on concrete platforms while the city rattled and burned above them. Other historic cities like Coventry, Liverpool, and Manchester were similarly targeted, reduced to smoldering fields of rubble. While the Blitz caused immense civilian suffering, killing tens of thousands of innocent people, it proved to be a fatal strategic blunder for Germany. By shifting their focus to the cities, the Luftwaffe handed the battered airfields of the Royal Air Force a vital window of opportunity to rebuild, repair, and replace lost fighters and pilots. The climax of the battle arrived on September 15, 1940, a date now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day. Göring launched a massive, all-out daylight assault on London, confident that the RAF was down to its final remaining aircraft. Instead, they were met by a fully reorganized and ferocious British defense. The RAF shot down German aircraft at a catastrophic rate, proving definitively that the skies over England could not be conquered. Realizing that air superiority was an unattainable dream, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion. The small group of Allied pilots, comprising British, Polish, Czech, Canadian, and American volunteers, had achieved the impossible. Churchill immortalized their sacrifice in the House of Commons, declaring that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. For the first time since his rise to power, Hitler's war machine had been decisively stopped. With the skies over Britain stubbornly closed, Adolf Hitler grew increasingly impatient. His ultimate ideological ambition had never been the conquest of Western Europe. Since the inception of his political movement, his eyes had been fixed firmly on the East. He coveted the vast agricultural lands of Ukraine and the immense oil fields of the Caucasus, viewing them as the essential Lebensraum or living space for his envisioned thousand-year Reich. He also sought the total destruction of Slavic civilization and the absolute eradication of Soviet communism. Before he could unleash his armies onto the Soviet Union, however, a sudden crisis in the Balkans forced a dangerous delay. In October of 1940, Benito Mussolini, jealous of Hitler's stunning triumphs, launched a disastrous, uncoordinated invasion of Greece from Italian-occupied Albania. The Greek army fought back with incredible ferocity, completely routing the Italian forces and driving them back into Albania. At the same time, a pro-Western coup in Yugoslavia threatened to destabilize Germany's southern flank. Fearing a British intervention in the Balkans that could threaten Germany's vital oil supplies in Romania, Hitler was forced to intervene. In April of 1941, the German war machine rolled into Yugoslavia and Greece, crushing all resistance in a matter of weeks. While the Balkans campaign was a brilliant tactical success, it carried a catastrophic strategic price tag. It delayed the invasion of the Soviet Union by 6 critical weeks, weeks that would prove decisive when the harsh Russian winter arrived. On June 22, 1941, the largest military operation in human history began. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, 3 million German and Axis soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged across the 3,000-mile Soviet border. The assault caught Joseph Stalin completely by surprise, despite months of explicit warnings from his own intelligence networks. The German forces attacked in 3 massive army groups. Army Group North raced through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center drove directly toward Moscow. Army Group South plunged into the fertile plains of Ukraine. The Luftwaffe systematically destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground within the first 48 hours, gaining absolute control of the skies. During the summer and autumn of 1941, the Blitzkrieg achieved unprecedented levels of destruction. Utilizing massive pincer movements, German panzer divisions encircled entire Soviet armies. At Białystok, Minsk, and Kiev, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were cut off and captured in breathtakingly short periods. To the outside world, the total collapse of the Soviet Union appeared completely inevitable. But beneath the surface of these staggering victories, a different kind of war was taking shape. Operation Barbarossa was not a conventional campaign. It was explicitly planned as a war of annihilation. Behind the advancing front lines marched the Einsatzgruppen, specialized SS mobile killing squads. Their mission was the systematic execution of Jewish populations, communist officials, and anyone deemed an enemy of the Reich, marking the terrifying escalation of the Holocaust. Despite suffering millions of casualties and losing vast amounts of industrial territory, the Soviet Union refused to collapse. The sheer scale of the Russian landscape began to swallow the German war machine. Supply lines became dangerously stretched over thousands of miles of poor roads that turned into thick, impassable quagmires of mud during the autumn rains. By November, the mud froze and the temperature plummeted. Hitler, confident of a quick victory, had flatly refused to supply his troops with winter clothing or equipment. German soldiers found themselves fighting in summer uniforms in temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero. Mechanized equipment failed. Oil froze inside tank engines and weapons jammed. Despite these horrific conditions, Army Group Center launched a final, desperate push toward Moscow. By early December, advanced German reconnaissance units could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They had reached their absolute limit. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Red Army unleashed a massive, unexpected counteroffensive. Commanded by General Georgy Zhukov and reinforced by fresh, elite, winter-hardened divisions transferred from Siberia, the Soviets smashed into the exhausted German lines. The German forces were thrown back from the gates of Moscow, suffering their first major strategic defeat on land. The illusion of Nazi invincibility was permanently broken. While the frozen forests outside Moscow turned into a massive graveyard for the German infantry, a sudden detonation on the other side of the planet permanently altered the geopolitical landscape. Since its aggressive expansion into Manchuria and China, the Empire of Japan had found itself increasingly locked in a diplomatic deadlock with the United States. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, determined to curb Japanese militarism without entering a shooting war, had imposed a sequence of severe economic sanctions on Tokyo. The fatal blow arrived in the summer of 1941, when the United States, alongside Great Britain and the Netherlands, enacted a total oil embargo against Japan. For an island nation that imported over 90% of its oil, this was an economic death sentence. Japan's military leaders, spearheaded by General Hideki Tojo, calculated that they had less than 2 years of oil reserves left. They faced a stark choice: capitulate to American diplomatic demands and withdraw from China, or launch a desperate strike to seize the resource-rich oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Choosing war, the Japanese military high command concluded that to secure their expansion into Southeast Asia, they had to first neutralize the only force capable of stopping them: the United States Pacific Fleet, stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the quiet morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941. A massive strike force of 6 Japanese aircraft carriers unleashed a surprise aerial assault on the naval base. In 2 devastating waves, over 350 Japanese warplanes swarmed over Oahu, dropping torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs on the unsuspecting American fleet. Within a matter of hours, 4 battleships were sunk, dozens of aircraft were obliterated on the ground, and over 2,400 American servicemen lost their lives. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, famously declaring December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States formally declared war on Japan, ending decades of isolationism. 3 days later, in a spectacular display of strategic arrogance, Adolf Hitler honored his alliance with Tokyo and declared war on the United States. Within a single week, the separate conflicts in Europe and Asia fused into a singular, gargantuan global conflagration. The initial months following Pearl Harbor were a disaster for the Allies. Moving with breathtaking speed and coordination, Japanese forces launched simultaneous invasions across the Pacific. Hong Kong fell. Malaya was overrun. In February of 1942, the strategic British fortress of Singapore surrendered, a catastrophic humiliation that Churchill described as the worst disaster in British military history. In the Philippines, a combined American and Filipino force under General Douglas MacArthur staged a heroic defense on the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. Overwhelmed by superior numbers and starved of supplies, the defenders were ultimately forced to surrender. Thousands of prisoners of war were subjected to the horrific brutality of the Bataan Death March, a grueling, 65-mile trek through tropical heat where soldiers were systematically beaten, starved, and executed by their captors. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire had reached its absolute zenith, controlling a vast oceanic realm that stretched from the borders of India to the mid-Pacific. But this rapid expansion had left their defensive perimeter dangerously overextended. The turning point arrived in June of 1942, near a tiny, isolated coral atoll known as Midway. United States Naval Intelligence, having brilliantly cracked the Japanese Naval Code, discovered a massive plan to ambush the remaining American aircraft carriers. Armed with this priceless knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned 3 American carriers exactly where the Japanese strike force would arrive. The Battle of Midway was a spectacular tactical reversal. In a decisive 5-minute window on June 4th, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers with their decks cluttered with fueled aircraft and exposed munitions. The bombers struck with lethal precision, sinking 4 of Japan's premier aircraft carriers and killing hundreds of their most experienced naval aviators. The spine of the Imperial Japanese Navy was permanently broken, shifting the strategic initiative in the Pacific entirely to the United States. With the tide officially turning in the Pacific after the miracle at Midway, the focus of the global conflict shifted heavily back to the bloody plains of Europe. By the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler realized that his original plan to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign had failed. The German army had suffered massive casualties outside Moscow, and the Third Reich was running dangerously low on fuel. To solve this strategic crisis, Hitler launched Case Blue, a massive summer offensive aimed at the southern Soviet Union. The primary objective was to capture the oil-rich Caucasus region. However, as German armored columns pushed south, Hitler grew obsessed with a city bearing the name of his ultimate ideological rival. Stalingrad was a major industrial center stretching along the banks of the Volga River. By September of 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, had fought its way into the suburbs of the city. What followed was the most brutal, destructive urban battle in human history. The conflict in Stalingrad dissolved into a horrific, close-quarters nightmare that the German soldiers called Rattenkrieg or Rats' War. Heavy panzer divisions were virtually useless in the narrow, debris-choked streets. The battle was fought block by block, building by building, room by room. Factories, train stations, and apartment complexes changed hands multiple times a day. Soviet soldiers operating under Joseph Stalin's famous Order No. 227, not a step back, clung to the ruins with absolute desperation, pinning the Germans down just yards from the Volga River. While the German Sixth Army exhausted itself inside the burning shell of the city, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov was secretly preparing a massive trap. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified German forces directly, the Soviets unleashed a massive pincer movement against the weak Romanian and Italian divisions protecting the German flanks. Within 4 days, the Soviet pincers met, completely encircling the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad and trapping over 250,000 Axis soldiers. Hitler flatly refused to allow Paulus to launch a breakout operation. Instead, he falsely promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army from the air, while a rescue force commanded by Erich von Manstein attempted to break the siege from the outside. Both efforts failed catastrophically. As the brutal Russian winter set in, the trapped German soldiers starved, froze, and ran completely out of ammunition. On February 2, 1943, against Hitler's explicit orders, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus officially surrendered the remains of his army. Only 91,000 German soldiers survived to walk into captivity. The vast majority would never return home. Stalingrad was a psychological and military cataclysm for the Third Reich. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front was permanently lost, and the long, agonizing retreat back to Berlin had officially begun. While the German army was being bled white at Stalingrad, a parallel turning point was unfolding in the desert sands of North Africa. For 2 years, the British Eighth Army had been locked in a pendulum-like struggle against the legendary German Afrika Korps, commanded by the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The ultimate prize was Egypt, specifically the Suez Canal, which served as Great Britain's vital logistical lifeline to India and its Middle Eastern oil fields. By July of 1942, Rommel had driven the British back to a tiny, isolated railway stop just 60 miles from Alexandria. El Alamein. In August, a new British commander took control of the Eighth Army, General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery spent months methodically building up a massive superiority in tanks, artillery, and fuel, utilizing supplies sent by the United States. On the night of October 23, 1942. The battle began with a spectacular artillery barrage from over 1,000 British guns. Montgomery's forces launched a brutal war of attrition, methodically clearing deep German minefields that Rommel had dubbed the Devil's Gardens. After 12 days of fierce, relentless fighting, the British broke through the Axis lines. Rommel, dangerously low on fuel and tanks, was forced to initiate a retreat across Libya. Days later, the Axis position in Africa collapsed completely. On November 8, 1942, a combined American and British force launched Operation Torch, executing massive amphibious landings in Morocco and Algeria. Caught in a giant strategic pincer between Montgomery advancing from the east and the Americans pushing from the west, the remaining Axis forces in Africa were cornered in Tunisia. In May of 1943, over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. North Africa was completely cleared of Axis forces, opening the underbelly of occupied Europe to an Allied invasion. With North Africa completely cleared of Axis forces, the Allied High Command turned their sights toward southern Europe. Winston Churchill famously referred to Italy as the soft underbelly of the Axis, believing an invasion there would quickly knock Italy out of the war and force Hitler to divert precious divisions from the Eastern Front. In July of 1943, a massive Allied amphibious armada launched Operation Husky, invading the island of Sicily. The operation was a resounding success, shattering the morale of the Italian military and triggering a massive political coup in Rome. King Victor Emmanuel III officially dismissed Benito Mussolini from office, ordering his immediate arrest. The new Italian government promptly opened secret negotiations with the Allies, culminating in a total Italian surrender in September of 1943. However, any hopes of a swift, easy march up the Italian peninsula were immediately dashed. Anticipating the collapse of their ally, German forces commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring rapidly occupied the country. What followed was one of the most grueling, brutal mountain campaigns in military history. The Germans constructed a series of formidable defensive structures across the narrow Italian peninsula, the most famous being the Gustav Line, anchored by the historic mountaintop monastery of Monte Cassino. For months, American, British, and Commonwealth soldiers fought through treacherous mountain passes, freezing rain, and deep mud, facing a highly disciplined German defense that contested every inch of high ground. Rome was finally liberated in June of 1944, but the campaign in Italy had turned into a slow, bloody war of attrition that would continue until the final days of the conflict. While the Allies clawed their way through the Italian mountains, an even greater operation was being meticulously prepared in the utmost secrecy across Great Britain. For over 2 years, millions of tons of military equipment and over 1.5 million American and Canadian troops poured into England. The time had come to execute the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. Operation Overlord, commanded by Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion was scheduled to take place along a 50-mile stretch of heavily fortified coastline in Normandy, France. To oppose this massive assault, Hitler had spent years constructing the Atlantic Wall, a colossal network of concrete bunkers, landmines, barbed wire, and tank obstacles stretching from Norway to the border of Spain. The success of the invasion depended entirely on a massive, complex deception campaign known as Operation Fortitude. Through fake radio traffic, double agents, and an entire phantom army composed of inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft under the nominal command of General George S. Patton, the Allies successfully convinced the German High Command that the real invasion would take place further north, at the Pas de Calais. The deception worked brilliantly, keeping vital German panzer divisions held back even after the first troops hit the beaches. On the night of June 5, 1944, thousands of Allied paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, alongside the British 6th Airborne, dropped behind enemy lines in pitch darkness. Their mission was to secure vital bridges, seize crossroads, and silence German artillery batteries before the main beach landings began at dawn on June 6, 1944. Forever immortalized as D-Day, the largest amphibious assault in human history commenced. Nearly 7,000 ships and landing craft unleashed over 150,000 Allied soldiers onto 5 designated beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword.at. Omaha Beach. The operation came dangerously close to total disaster. The preparatory aerial and naval bombardment had missed the primary German defenses, leaving the veteran German 352nd Infantry Division completely intact. As the ramps of the landing craft dropped, American soldiers were met with a devastating wall of machine gun and artillery fire from the high bluffs above. Tied down on the blood-soaked sand, suffering thousands of casualties within the first few hours, small groups of surviving soldiers displayed immense bravery. They breached the seawall, scaled the steep cliffs, and systematically destroyed the German bunkers. By nightfall, all 5 beachheads were secured. The Atlantic Wall was broken, and a permanent Allied foothold was established in Western Europe. Following the breakthrough on the beaches of Normandy, the Allied armies faced a grueling battle through the French hedgerows, known as the bocage. These dense, centuries-old earthen walls and thick shrubbery provided the perfect defensive cover for German anti-tank teams and snipers. For nearly 2 months, the advance was measured in yards, costing thousands of lives. The deadlock was finally broken in late July of 1944 with Operation Cobra. A massive aerial bombardment pulverized the German lines near St. Lo, allowing General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army to burst through the gap. Patton's armor raced into the open French countryside, executing a rapid encirclement that trapped over 50,000 German soldiers in the Falaise pocket. The German retreat quickly turned into a rout. On August 25, 1944, French and American troops officially liberated Paris, ending 4 years of bitter Nazi occupation. Within weeks, Allied forces surged across Belgium and reached the very borders of the German fatherland. Wishing to end the war before the arrival of winter, British General Bernard Montgomery proposed a daring plan, Operation Market Garden. Launched in September of 1944, it was the largest airborne operation in history. 3 airborne divisions were dropped deep behind enemy lines in the Netherlands to seize a sequence of vital bridges spanning the Rhine River, while British armored columns rushed north to link up with them. The operation was a bridge too far. Unexpectedly encountering battle-hardened German panzer divisions refitting in the area, the Allied paratroopers were overwhelmed. At the final bridge in Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division was virtually destroyed. Market Garden failed in its ultimate goal to cross the Rhine, and the Allied advance ground to a temporary halt as supply lines stretched dangerously thin from the coast. Sensing a final opportunity to alter the course of the war, Adolf Hitler engineered one last, desperate gamble on the Western Front. In absolute secrecy, he massed 250,000 elite German troops and his remaining armored reserves in the heavily forested Ardennes region, the exact same location where he had broken the French lines in 1940. On the freezing morning of December 16, 1944, amidst heavy fog that grounded the superior Allied air forces, the Germans launched a massive counteroffensive. Their goal was to smash through the thinly defended American lines, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital Allied supply port of Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies in two. The German onslaught caught the Allied High Command completely by surprise. The armored spearheads tore through the American lines, creating a massive outward protrusion in the map that gave the conflict its historic name, the Battle of the Bulge. Despite the initial chaos, isolated American units fought heroic delaying actions in freezing conditions. At the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, the American 101st Airborne Division found themselves completely surrounded by German forces. When formally demanded to surrender, the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, delivered a legendary one-word response: "Nuts!" By late December, the weather cleared, allowing Allied fighter bombers to return to the skies and systematically destroy the exposed German armored columns. General Patton executed a brilliant logistical maneuver, turning his entire army north in the middle of winter to relieve the besieged defenders at Bastogne. By January of 1945, the German offensive was entirely spent. It was the bloodiest single battle fought by the United States military in the war, but it completely exhausted Hitler's final operational reserves of manpower, armor, and fuel, leaving the Reich utterly defenseless. While the German military collapsed on the Western Front, an even more terrifying juggernaut was unleashed from the east. In January of 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched its massive Vistula-Oder offensive. Commanded by Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, millions of Soviet soldiers, backed by thousands of heavy tanks and artillery pieces, smashed through the German lines in Poland. Moving with unprecedented speed, the Red Army advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, liberating Warsaw and pushing the front line to the banks of the Oder River, a mere 45 miles east of Berlin. The rapid advance of the Soviet forces triggered the largest mass migration in human history. Millions of German civilians fled their homes in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, desperate to escape the wrath of the advancing Red Army. The Soviet soldiers, driven by years of brutal Nazi atrocities on their own soil, exacted a fierce vengeance as they crossed into the borders of the German fatherland. Towns were burned, property was destroyed, and civilians suffered immense trauma. The German population was now tasting the horrific realities of a total war that their own leaders had unleashed upon the world. By February of 1945, the leaders of the big three Allied powers, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, gathered at the Black Sea resort town of Yalta to decide the final shape of the post-war world. It was clear to everyone in the room that Germany was utterly defeated. The Yalta Conference laid the groundwork for the modern geopolitical landscape. The leaders agreed that after its unconditional surrender, Germany would be split into 4 distinct occupation zones, controlled by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, despite being deep within the Soviet sector, would also be divided into 4 sections. Stalin promised to allow free elections in the newly liberated countries of Eastern Europe, a promise he would quickly break, setting the stage for the decades-long confrontation of the Cold War. In March of 1945, the Western Allies executed their final barrier crossing into Germany. American troops discovered the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen completely intact, braving heavy fire to cross the Rhine River before German engineers could detonate it. Further north, British and Canadian forces crossed the river in a massive amphibious and airborne operation. The industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, was completely encircled, forcing over 300,000 German soldiers to lay down their weapons. The Allied armies surged across central Germany, liberating towns, capturing major cities, and discovering the horrific horrors of the Nazi concentration camps, including Buchenwald and Dachau. The true industrial scale of the Holocaust was finally unveiled to a horrified global public by mid-April. The stage was set for the final bloody climax in Europe, the Battle of Berlin. Joseph Stalin ordered his generals to capture the German capital at any cost before the Western Allies could reach it. On April 16, 1945, over 2 million Soviet soldiers unleashed a cataclysmic artillery bombardment on the German defenses along the Oder River. Commencing the assault on the city, Berlin was defended by a desperate, patched-together force consisting of exhausted regular soldiers, wounded veterans, fanatic SS units, and young boys from the Hitler Youth, some as young as 12 years old, armed with single-shot anti-tank weapons. The Soviet forces methodically fought their way through the shattered, debris-choked streets of the capital, using heavy artillery and rocket launchers to flatten entire city blocks. The fighting was fierce and fanatical, turning the historic landmarks of Berlin into a burning wasteland. Deep beneath the surface of the ruined city, insulated from the constant rumble of Soviet artillery, Adolf Hitler spent his final days inside the underground Führer bunker. Shaken by tremors, detached from reality, and increasingly delusional, the dictator continued to issue worthless orders to phantom armies that no longer existed, accusing his top generals of high treason and abandonment. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops fighting just blocks away from the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, ending his tyrannical dream of a 1,000-year Reich. His body was immediately carried up to the garden above and burned with gasoline to prevent it from being captured by the enemy. 2 days later, on May 2nd, the remaining defenders of Berlin officially surrendered to the Red Army. Soviet soldiers raised the iconic red hammer and sickle flag over the ruined dome of the Reichstag building, signaling the symbolic end of Nazi tyranny in Europe. On May 7, 1945, at a small red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The document went into effect at midnight on May 8th, a date forever celebrated as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. Millions of citizens poured into the streets of New York, London, and Paris to celebrate the end of a long, dark night of fascist oppression. But while the fires were extinguished in Europe, a brutal, uncompromising conflict was still raging across the islands of the Pacific. Throughout 1944 and 1945, the United States military had waged a relentless, dual-pronged offensive across the Pacific, utilizing a highly effective strategy known as island hopping. Instead of launching costly assaults on every heavily fortified Japanese island, American forces bypassed strongpoints, seizing strategic islands to construct airfields and naval bases, leaving the remaining Japanese garrisons isolated and starved of supplies. Admiral Chester Nimitz led the naval advance through the Central Pacific, capturing Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan. Meanwhile, General Douglas MacArthur fulfilled his famous promise to return, leading a massive amphibious invasion of the Philippines in October of 1944. The Japanese Navy made a final, desperate attempt to destroy the invasion fleet at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval confrontation in human history. The battle resulted in the absolute destruction of Japan's remaining naval power, witnessing the first organized use of kamikaze suicide attacks, where Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their explosive-laden aircraft into American warships. With the capture of the Mariana Islands, the United States built massive airfields capable of launching their revolutionary new long-range bombers, the B-29 Superfortress. Command of the strategic bombing campaign was handed to General Curtis LeMay, who initiated a devastating new tactic: low-altitude, nighttime incendiary bombing of Japan's wooden cities. On the night of March 9, 1945, Operation Meeting House commenced. Over 300 B-29 bombers dropped thousands of tons of napalm and incendiary cluster bombs directly over Tokyo. The attack created a massive, uncontrollable firestorm that generated hurricane-force winds of superheated air, consuming over 16 square miles of the capital and killing an estimated 100,000 people in a single night. It was the most destructive single bombing raid in aviation history, turning other industrial cities like Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe into vast fields of ash. Despite the absolute destruction of their cities and the total blockade of their shipping lanes, the militarist government of Japan flatly refused to surrender. Their military philosophy was governed by the ancient samurai code of Bushido, the belief that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. They began preparing for a final, apocalyptic defense of their home islands, mobilizing millions of civilian men, women, and children into a national militia armed with bamboo spears and primitive explosives. The sheer ferocity of this fanatical resistance was demonstrated on the volcanic islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In February of 1945, American Marines landed on the black sands of Iwo Jima, facing a highly disciplined Japanese garrison buried deep inside an intricate network of underground tunnels, caves, and bunkers. The island was captured only after a month of brutal, close-quarters fighting, costing the lives of nearly 7,000 Marines and virtually the entire 21,000 Japanese defenders. An even more horrific struggle unfolded in April of 1945 on the island of Okinawa, located just 300 miles south of the Japanese mainland. The battle lasted for 82 agonizing days, turning into a bloody war of attrition under a relentless rain of kamikaze attacks that damaged or sank hundreds of American ships. Over 12,000 American servicemen were killed, alongside 100,000 Japanese soldiers and an equal number of innocent Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire. The staggering casualties of Okinawa deeply weighed on the minds of American military planners. Estimates for a full-scale amphibious invasion of the Japanese mainland, scheduled for late 1945, projected